Thank you all very much. It's wonderful to have the opportunity to speak with you today about the St. Francis Dam disaster. I see many familiar faces from Piru Cemetery this morning, so it's been a long day of talking about St. Francis for many. The work I'll be talking about today, primarily the way I collected this information was through my master's thesis research. So I'll talk a little bit about that and how I came about the information. I work for the National Park Service as an archaeologist, but I am here today in an unofficial capacity with my first love, which is the St. Francis Dam disaster. To just get theory out of the way real quick, this is kind of what I'm looking at when I'm going into cemeteries and seeing the grave markers. I'm trying to understand the commemorative activities that took place. So as an archaeologist, although I do excavate at times, I primarily am a landscape archaeologist, and in particular, I'm a tattlephile. I enjoy spending time in cemeteries. What I'm ultimately interested in is the memory forming that takes place in these cemeteries, and the fancy term is phenomenological perception, where you're picking up and having these interactions with the environment, although you don't necessarily notice it. And ultimately, it's the funerary process, the burial of bodies, disposal, and the social remembering that takes place. So we'll just get that all out of the way there. Why this is important, this sort of research. This, if you live in Santa Paula, you recognize this is recently after the Thomas fire. These are the motorcycle policemen that are being commemorated for the St. Francis disaster, but they have fire masks on. And you see the message. It's really great to see these memorials being reincorporated in a different way into the community, and it keeps that memory alive. This is essentially how I formulated my master's thesis. I was specifically interested in how the victims are memorialized and commemorated, both spatially within a landscape as well as conceptually. And I was looking at what social, political, and economic factors influence the forgetting of this disaster. And I was also interested in something that's much more atheoretical, but how many victims of the disaster were there? That's not something that's previously been compiled, and that's something that I undertook as part of this. So the methods, essentially, I spent a lot of time in regional archives. I am a genealogist at heart and did the genealogical research for each one of the victims, and then reached out using some various resources to document out-of-state graves. And our story starts with William Mulholland. My thesis writing in 2013 corresponded with the occurrence of the 100-year anniversary of the Owens Valley, Los Angeles Aqueduct. Commemorative events at that time included reenactment ceremony that was held on November 5th, 2013 at the Cascades, and it was attended by the mayor and other city officials, descendants of William Mulholland and Frederick Eaton, lots of LADWP employees, and this is at the Cascades. The 5 and 14 freeways meet just in front of that. Mulholland had stood on this same spot 100 years ago to the day before a crowd of nearly 30,000. He proclaimed, "This rude platform is an altar, and on it we are here consecrating this water supply and dedicating the aqueduct to you and your children's children, your children and your children's children for all time," before losing the crowd's attention and gesturing towards the water and shouting, "There it is, take it." Other commemorative activities celebrating the centennial illustrated diverse community responses to both the aqueduct and its history. The Natural History Museum of Los Angeles celebrated its own centennial the day after the aqueduct with the opening of Just Add Water in its historic rotunda. The exhibit of artworks inspired by the aqueduct invited visitors to discover the complex story of water in Los Angeles and to think about it in new and different ways. Another event included 100 mules walking the Los Angeles Aqueduct. It was a performative parade of 100 mules traversing pipelines and canals that bring water from the eastern Sierras through a gravity-fed system to Los Angeles. Despite these commemoratory events, public acknowledgement and reflection about the aqueduct is limited. For most Angelenos, the history behind how they come to have tap water direct from the eastern Sierras is now an obscure and distant episode. History buffs and film aficionados might stumble across Chinatown, referenced here, and recognize similarities between elements in the plot and its nonfiction counterparts in Los Angeles history. But very many people are unaware that the aqueduct significantly impacted both the physical and cultural landscape of most of the southern part of the state. Over time, treatment of the topic has been relegated to tacit acceptance of a certain status quo. Essentially, Mulholland has also received a similar fate. He is seen both as villain and visionary, one capable of considerable construction feats, yet also responsible for the collapse of a key storage dam, which resulted in significant loss of life. The politics of bringing Owens Valley water to Los Angeles and the legacy of William Mulholland, chief engineer of the St. Francis Dam, both transcend the St. Francis Dam disaster and add many layers of complexity to understanding why this event has largely been forgotten. The dam was constructed by William Mulholland. As was tradition in that era, Mulholland was somewhat self-taught. He educated himself by associating with many of the best water resource engineers of the time, by taking on an increasingly technical workload, and through reading technical literature. Mulholland had a reputation as one that could get big things done, as well as possessing a willingness to work in the field under very difficult conditions. Beyond his monumental achievement of constructing the Los Angeles Aqueduct, which is a 233-mile gravity-fed system conveying water from the Owens Valley to Los Angeles, he also consulted on a number of hydraulic fill dam projects. His first concrete dam, however, was the Weed Canyon Dam, later renamed the Mulholland Dam, but today is better known by the Hollywood Reservoir. In 1924, the Bureau of Water Works and Supply constructed the approximately 200-foot-high concrete gravity arch dam in the hills just below where the Hollywood sign sits today. It was also in 1924 that Mulholland first publicly declared his intention to construct a large storage reservoir to hold a one-year backup supply of water for Los Angeles. During aqueduct construction, Mulholland had recognized the possibility of placing a dam adjacent to the San Francisco Canyon Aqueduct construction camps. And the area was alluvial in a flat between power plants 1 and 2 in San Francisco Canyon. Mulholland perceived that the natural topography of the canyon was conducive to a large water storage area with a narrow dam. The site was also ideal because it's in the Angeles National Forest, where the majority of the canyon's occupants were Bureau of Power and Light workers and their families living on land which had previously been acquired during planning of the aqueduct and adjacent power plants. Numerous sabotage attempts against the aqueduct, explosive population growth in Los Angeles, several years of drought, as well as the potential for seismic activity along the aqueduct, prompted the immediate need for the construction of additional water storage south of the San Andreas fault line. So the construction of the St. Francis Dam proceeded between 1924 and 1926. Cracks began to appear in the dam during the initial filling. Mulholland referred to these fractures, which were widest at the base and narrowest upwards, as transverse contraction cracks. In 1927, these cracks were filled with hemp and sealed with oakum and back covered with cement grout. In 1928, when spring runoff arrived, these leaks from the previous year came back and additional leaks developed at the abutments. On March 7, 1928, the reservoir was filled to capacity. On the morning of March 12th, dam keeper Tony Harnischfeger contacted Mulholland to notify him that the dam appeared to be leaking on the western abutment and the discharge was dirty. Dirty seepage can be an indication that foundational material is eroding. Upon inspecting the dam with assistant Harvey Van Norman, they both judged the leaks to be normal, assured dam keeper Harnischfeger of the soundness, and deemed the dam safe. Harnischfeger, his son Coroner, and girlfriend Leona were the first victims of the dam's collapse. Less than 12 hours after having received a safety inspection by city engineers, the St. Francis Dam catastrophically failed. There was 12.38 billion gallons of water which drained from the reservoir, and this took place in less than 72 minutes. Floodwaters traveled down San Francisco Canyon through the Santa Clara River Valley and arrived at the Pacific Ocean 5 hours later. At 11:57.5, instruments at Power Plant 1 registered a sudden drop in voltage, as did 2 receiving stations in Los Angeles, causing city lights to briefly flicker. An oil switch, well, we know Don's arrived. It's all good, Don. An oil switch at the Edison Company substation at Saugus also exploded at this same time due to overloading of the transmission lines that ran to Lancaster. Within a few minutes, the floodwaters, which were initially over 140 feet high and traveling down the canyon at approximately 18 miles per hour, reached Power Plant 2 and the adjacent workers' community located 7,300 feet downstream from the dam site. The community consisted of 11 bungalows, a clubhouse, a schoolhouse with garages for personal and city cars. The above ground portion of the power plant and all the workers' community was completely swept away. There were 72 individuals that were killed that night at that location. 3 survived, so there were 75 people that evening in that community. This image here, essentially, I found a map in the DWP archives that indicated where each of the bungalows was located. And I overlaid this with an aerial photograph. And this is something that I worked with a fellow Dammy with, Keith Bettleman. We worked on this together to kind of illustrate where each of the families lived. There's no estimate available indicating how many individuals in San Francisco Canyon were living south of the Power Plant 2 community. The area was so remote that there were actually no adequate maps that existed before the flood. And to determine the actual acreage of crops destroyed, the claims agents built a map using legal descriptions of the properties. At least 37 were killed in this section of the canyon. After traveling through the farmsteads and ranches of the canyon, the floodwaters reached the Santa Clara River, coming out at Soledad Canyon. Floodwaters did not reach the town centers of New Holland, Castaic. However, at least 45 individuals were killed who lived and worked on their family ranches and New Hall ranch lands west of Castaic, as well as at the Southern California Edison's substation at Saugus. There was also the Southern Pacific sighting at Castaic that was mentioned. That was the section camp that was there. At 12:40 a.m., the flood reached the Edison Company substation, causing power outages throughout Ventura and Santa Barbara and Los Angeles counties. 1 hour after the dam failure, 60-foot floodwaters reached Castaic Junction. This completely eradicated McIntyre's service station, which also had a diner and 7 tourist cabins. At Castaic, Highway 99, today known as the 5, was completely buried under several feet of debris. At 1:09 a.m., employees at Power Plant 1 reported to LA City officials that the Canyon Road was out and the St. Francis Reservoir was nearly empty. This initiated efforts to alert downstream residents in the Santa Clara River Valley. Widespread power outages made this a difficult endeavor, though County Sheriff's Office in Ventura was finally notified at 1:15 a.m. The warning was immediately relayed to Santa Paula and Fillmore. This prompted evacuations throughout the valley, resulted in thousands of lives being saved. Unfortunately, word of the impending floodwaters did not reach the Southern California Edison Company's temporary construction camp, which was located just west of the LA Ventura County line at the Southern Pacific Railroad siding that was named Kempt. A 60-foot wall of water traveling 12.5 miles per hour washed over the workers as they slept in canvas tents. The natural topography of the area created a huge whirlpool, resulting in significant loss of life. There were 85 of 148 men that were killed at the Edison camp. The story that was passed along to me is that these men were in canvas tents, and the tents that were zipped up, they floated to safety, and if the tents were unzipped, they became inundated with silt and water, and all the men in the tent drowned. Law enforcement officers provided warning up and down the valley, though they were unable to reach Fillmore before the floodwaters did. At 2:20 a.m., the flood reached the communities of Fillmore and Bardsdale, situated on opposite banks of the Santa Clara River. The bridge connecting the two communities was instantly destroyed. Residents of Fillmore had approximately 30 minutes notice of impending floodwaters, resulting in low loss of life. On the other side of the Santa Clara River, Bardsdale residents only received a moment's notice. 70 individuals from the 8-mile stretch spanning Piru, Fillmore, and Bardsdale were killed. During this time, evacuations in the low-lying areas of Santa Paula were underway. The whistle at the Union Oil Refinery sounded steady shrieks. Patrolman Thornton Edwards, John Messer, Lee Shepard, and Stanley Baker drove up and down the streets with sirens blaring in attempts to warn as many residents as possible. Telephone switchboard operators at Santa Paula stuck to their posts and rang rural residents, providing warning to head for the hills. As the dam had only been completed in 1926, most residents were actually unaware of its existence. Some residents chose to ignore warnings to evacuate. Many of the residents in the low-lying areas adjacent to the Santa Clara River were Mexicans, and there was a language barrier between police and residents that is said to have delayed some evacuations. Patrolman Edwards would later express that when we aroused those Mexicans down by the river, all I could say was mucha agua, which we heard right on the tape, and pointed east. Many of them laughed and looked up at the sky and said, "No está lloviendo," it's not raining. The collapse of the Willard Bridge east of town, a frightful sound heard for miles, served as a final warning. Despite being the most densely populated of all the communities of the flood zone, there were only 16 deaths in Santa Paula. The floodwaters, which took 5.5 hours to travel from the dam site to the ocean, caused a 54-mile wide path of destruction and death from the mountains to the sea. The waters carried buildings, trees, fences, telegraph and power poles, railway tracks, livestock, and many bodies. Various aspects of the dam's design has been judged problematic. Twice during construction, engineers added capacity to the reservoir by increasing the dam's height. They also added a concrete wing dike 1,300 feet past the dam's west abutment. This created a dangerous situation, as the strength of a gravity dam is dependent on a prescribed width-height ratio. This and other design oversights all resulted in the dam being a less than conservative design. Recent assessments have determined that, among other factors, the eastern abutment was unknowingly built on a massive paleo-mega landslide. In 1992, a forensic engineer named J. David Rogers identified 14 design deficiencies in dam construction, 7 of which would have singularly resulted in the dam's eventual failure. Design changes during construction, lack of incorporation of hydraulic uplift theory into the dam's design, failure to recognize that the dam would become saturated over time, and failure to provide the dam with grouted contraction joints were among the issues identified. However, the failure impacted the passage of the Boulder Canyon Project Act and design of the Hoover Dam, as well as influenced changes in dam design and construction in California and throughout the country. Currently, the findings of Rogers' analysis are generally accepted as a conclusive determination of how and why the dam failed. Catherine Mulholland saw Rogers' analysis as vindicating her grandfather of culpability. Others view his findings as further proof that Mulholland was responsible for the St. Francis Dam failure. The Los Angeles County Coroner's jury determined that the deaths were accidental, and that the weight of such important engineering feats should not be left to the determinations of one man, especially one that had limited experience building large concrete dams. Although he was dissatisfied with the findings and remained somewhat insolent regarding the accusations of incompetence, Mulholland did take full responsibility for the failure. At the coroner's inquest, he told the jury, "Don't blame anybody else, you just fasten it on me. If there's an error in human judgment, I was the human. I won't try to fasten it on anybody else." Los Angeles County residents were sympathetic of Mulholland and his culpability in the failure. In Ventura County, residents were not as supportive. Historian Charles Outland observed that the antipathy toward the water department and Mulholland were intense. One Santa Paula resident placed a sign on her front of her damaged home which stated, "Kill Mulholland." I've never actually seen this photo. If any of you do have, please pass it along. On the night of March 12, 1928, approximately 3,000 individuals were living in the direct path of the flood. That's a Department of Homeland Security statistic. At least 1,240 homes were partially or totally destroyed, and over 7,900 acres of farmland, citrus, walnuts, apricots, beets, beans, hay, alfalfa, vegetables, grapes, were inundated and ruined by erosion. Pilots were dispatched at sunrise to report the extent of the damage and photograph the expanse of the flood zone in preparation for expected litigation against the city of Los Angeles. The first priority was sheltering those left homeless and recovering the dead. The Los Angeles Police Department, LA County Sheriff's Office, available water department personnel, and many charitable service organizations, including the American Red Cross, American Legion, Boy Scouts of America, the Cruz Azul Mexicana, which was the Mexican Blue Cross, the Salvation Army, they were all mobilized immediately. In the early morning hours following the disaster, first aid stations, canteens, clothing deposits, and temporary housing were established by Red Cross chapters from Ventura, Los Angeles, and Kern counties. And they placed these canteens in Saugus, Newhall, Fillmore, and Santa Paula. Police were stationed throughout the flood zone to keep looters and sightseers at bay. Even in 28, people had to be looky-loos. Rescue teams searched for survivors who remained stranded. Several were found in Santa Paula, though further up the flood zone, it was quickly realized that there were few survivors. Efforts were focused on the systematic identification of bodies. Recovering bodies was aided by the use of tractors and steam shovels. The Fish and Game Commission searched far out to sea, and the American Legion of Ventura requisitioned 8 boats which they used to patrol up and down the coast. Only one body was found in the ocean, although others were found on snags near the mouth of the river or later floated back to the beaches of Oxnard and Hueneme, directly south of the Santa Clara River outlet. Makeshift morgues were established at multiple locations. Lists of the identified victims and descriptions of the unidentified victims were published daily in local papers. Coroner Frank Natz oversaw the handling of bodies in Los Angeles County, and Coroner Oliver Reardon coordinated efforts in Ventura County. He also personally prepared many of the victims for interment and made burial arrangements for both identified and unidentified individuals. Bodies were hosed down with hot water so they could be cleaned of mud and repositioned. They were then hosed with cold water and embalmed to extend preservation and held as long as possible for identification. At the Newhall temporary morgue, victims were laid out on narrow pine planks and placed at an angle against benches for viewing. Survivors traveled from morgue to morgue within and beyond the flood zone to identify family and neighbors. Mass burial services took place at Reese Cemetery and San Francisco Canyon and at the city cemeteries in Piru and Santa Paula. More than 3,000 are said to have attended the mass funeral held on March 19th at the city cemetery in Santa Paula. Although a concerted effort was made to search for victims, burning of large piles of debris on irreclaimable land in both San Francisco Canyon and throughout the Santa Clara River Valley likely served as funeral pyres for some. In the disaster's aftermath, the city of Los Angeles quickly announced that it would take financial responsibility of restoration efforts. A citizens restoration committee was formed to oversee the handling of claims. Offices were opened throughout the expanse of the flood-affected area to expedite the process. Identity, kinship, dependency, earning capacity, surviving family and children, and other like information necessary to determine proper consideration of each claim was compiled by Red Cross workers and City of Los Angeles claim agents. Restoration and reconstruction efforts were simultaneous with relief efforts. Los Angeles Mayor James Cryer issued the following statement, acknowledging the city's potential responsibility for damage to property. Los Angeles cannot restore the lives lost, but the property damage should be paid. Although Mayor Cryer initially planned to determine fully where legal liability lay before initiating the claims process, Van Norman and other water department officials told the city that no question of legal status of claims should ever be raised, and the moral obligation to repay the damage of the valley is sufficient. While conscience may have played a part in this decision, there was also a concern that a legal battle would jeopardize the city's position in other important matters, such as the water wars in the Owens Valley, as well as the Boulder Canyon project. The numerous boxes of claim files in the holdings of the LA DWP Record Center are a testament to the bureaucratic nature of the catastrophe. Funded by the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences at California State University, I was able to digitize and index a total of 817 death and personal property claim files and more than 5,000 pages of documents and photographs related to the disaster in support of my master's thesis research. These files hold a wealth of information, including leads on burial locations of recovered victims, details concerning individuals reported missing but not recovered, and insight into the claims process and resulting assignment of monetary value to human life in 1930s Los Angeles. This never-before-explored body of information provides a unique opportunity to examine social and economic conditions reflected by the adjudication of these claims. So these claim files were set up for disposition, and the Department of Water and Power, they have their own archives. All other city agencies have one central archive in Los Angeles, but the DWP does things their own way, and they have their own archive. Their consulting historian realized that the St. Francis files were up for disposition, meaning essentially they were supposed to be destroyed. And he felt this cannot take place, this is a very important event, so he reached out to local schools around Southern California, and my graduate advisor happened to be starting at CSUN the same time I was, and he heard about this, and he knew I was interested in doing a thesis related to cemeteries and memorialization. He asked me if I had heard of mass graves associated with the disaster, and that got me down here that weekend seeing what was going on, and I very quickly realized, especially being forgotten, that this was absolutely my thesis topic and that there was something that could be done here to help at least document and save these files. So that's what I did. Essentially, I did not digitize everything in those boxes. There was also real property. Real property is the land itself and doing the efforts to bring the land back so that it could be used for orchards, ranches again. That was just too extensive for my thesis project. It's another great project out there for somebody, but I specifically looked at death and personal property. So if somebody was killed in the disaster, or if they were injured in the disaster, or if they lost household goods in the disaster, those are the files that I digitized. And this is an example of what one of the claims, death claims, looks like. This is, the claimant is Joe Gottardi on this. And he lived on the Newhall Ranch lands, and this specific one is for his wife. She was recovered in Santa Paula, and so you see there's a coroner's record, SP-72. You can somewhat determine where a victim was recovered based on the coroner's number that they were assigned. They were assigned a Newhall's coroner's number, they weren't recovered in Ventura. They were recovered in Newhall. Same thing, it's Santa Paula, Ventura. That's likely where the body traveled to. As I digitized each of the claim files and compiled biographic information pertaining to each victim, then I interspersed these days of scanning and indexing at the DWP with visits to the cemeteries. I first started in Bardsdale, Piru, Santa Paula, and Ventura, and I was documenting grave markers of specifically the flood victims. I initially focused on identifying potential correlations between claim payout amounts and grave site commemoration. Found some interesting patterns in performing this analysis. For instance, while some payouts were so low that they did little more than cover the cost of the funeral expense, about $400, the settlement amount did not deter the placement of a grave marker. This is a claim payout on one side and the grave on the other, the marker. In other cases, grave markers were absent when claims payouts would have more than comfortably covered the cost of placing a memorial. Attempts to ascertain a relationship between payout amounts and gravesite commemoration proved difficult. And specifically, I recognized that over time, that when entire families were wiped out, it was the Red Cross and the Cruz Azul Mexicana that determined sometimes whether or not to mark the graves. So it wasn't actually the family making these decisions. One thing I did as far as analyzing the claim payouts is I wanted to find out if there was actually equality in these payouts. We knew we had Anglos, Mexican Americans, Japanese Americans, a number of different ethnicities. There was also a Native American gentleman that was killed in the disaster. And as I was going through the claims files, it was quite clear that there were a lot of racist undertones at the time. But the statistical analysis reveals that payouts were actually comparable amongst different ethnicities. And brass tacks, what it got down to is that the early Mexican payouts were extremely low. The people realized this, and so they sought counsel, and they lawyered up. And generally, most Anglos chose not to. The city and the county asked that people beware of ambulance chasers, that there would be attorneys in the area, and there was no need for that, that the city would pay out the claims equitably, but some people saw that was not taking place, so they did seek counsel. So overall, I found that Mexican American and Anglo-American payouts were very similar. This is the subset graph that's in there. There's one Native American. Like I said, there was also one African American killed, Solomon Byrd. He was Harry Carey's cook at the trading post. There was one Japanese, there was actually 2 Japanese Americans killed, but with the one claim, they were excluded by the California Alien Land Law, even though they were Japanese. So these are lists of the cemeteries that I visited. I first started in the flood zone and specifically went finding certain graves and realized, wow, this is very few victims, something's going on. So I went back to these cemeteries, recorded everybody that was buried in 1928 and did genealogy to see, am I missing something? You know, what's going on? And found that I didn't miss graves necessarily. It's that the victims are buried in many different graves, not just throughout Los Angeles, but the entire country. So you can kind of see, these are the cemeteries that I initially visited in the Los Angeles area. These are some of the burials from Southern California and what the graves look like. For the most part, none of the graves mention that people were killed in the St. Francis Dam break, but there is one in Santa Monica at Woodlawn Cemetery that does. And many of the markers that are in Spanish mention the disaster specifically. These are the burials at Piru Cemetery. There's the Zavala family. In Labrado, Velasco, he was a single man. He actually lived 4 days after the disaster, but he ended up dying of pneumonia because of exposure to the floodwaters. In reading his claim today at Piru Cemetery, I realized that he was rescued by August Rubel here at the Rancho. So that was quite interesting. You also have the Guittardi family that's all lined up together there, and then the Rogers and Topley family at the other end. There appears to be some sort of segregation in this, where there was the Mexican family was put at one end, the Mexican Italians were put in the center, and then the Anglo families were at the other side of this plot. And this seems to be a common theme throughout many of the cemeteries, indicating that there were segregated burials at the time. These are the burials at Bardsdale Cemetery, just a sampling of them. And there's 5 unmarked graves at Bardsdale Cemetery. The others have been marked. So I mentioned as I started to go through the cemeteries that I was not finding correlating burials for a lot of the victims. And as I started to extend those efforts, I came to realize that the victims are buried in 18 states throughout the United States. This is cemeteries throughout the U.S. outside. So there's Northern California, all the way, there's a burial in Hawaii. In total, my research revealed the burial locations of 308 recovered victims. These individuals are interred in 64 cemeteries across the United States. This is a unique feature of the St. Francis Dam disaster that sets it apart from many of the other disasters that I looked at in reference to this, including the Johnstown flood of 1889, the Buffalo Creek flood of 1972, and the Mill River flood of 1874. In each of these comparative cases, research reveals flood casualties were buried in just one or very few cemeteries within their respective flood zones. As the burial results and casualty demographics demonstrate, the economic circumstances of 1928 had men on the move in search of work, often far removed from their families and hometown. Southern Pacific Railroad transported bodies home free of charge, and the city of Los Angeles paid $150 towards the cost of each burial. These circumstances resulted in many flood victims being returned home for burial in family or community cemeteries once they were recovered and identified. What this graphic here is essentially illustrating is that for the most part, floods are indiscriminate. Old, young, gender, it takes people out, but these casualty demographics are showing the highest loss of life was men between 20 and 50 years of age. And it just shows that there were a lot of men that had moved here specifically work that weren't from the area. "68 unidentified victims of the disaster are buried in 2 cemeteries in the flood zone. All are in unmarked graves. There's 48 unknown victims that are buried along the west wall of Ivy Lawn Cemetery in Ventura. These are sexton records that actually tell us who's buried in each grave as far as the unidentified, so we can correlate the numbers. And this is a receipt for the city of Los Angeles purchasing a plot for a victim. Another 19 unknown dead are interred at Santa Paula Cemetery. In 2004, the Santa Paula Historical Society placed a commemorative marker at the spot of these unmarked graves. Due to his ethnicity, one identified man was not interred within the flood zone. He instead was taken to Evergreen Cemetery in East Los Angeles, where Japanese burials were permitted at the time. I just threw this in here last night. On Monday, I went by Santa Paula Cemetery and saw that the Historical Society and the cemetery had marked these unmarked graves. So they have white crosses marking these unmarked ones. One thing that's interesting to note is that the cemetery didn't mark any of the cenotaphs. Cenotaphs are where there's a marker present but no body. That makes sense. They don't have the burials in their records, and they don't necessarily keep track of the grave markers that are placed. So I found that an interesting thing. When I went through and counted, I was like, there's some missing. So that was information I was able to share with them. Also, subsequently, the coroner Reardon spent a lot of time attempting to identify the unidentified. So where in the cemetery records it says unknown, Santa Paula 41, we actually a lot of times know who that victim was. It just, when they finally figured out who it was, nobody contacted the cemetery to make them aware. So again, this was information I could pass along to them, so the next time they do this memorial, they could have some of the names on there. Approximately 43% of the graves of flood victims are memorialized with a grave marker, and 30% have been left unmarked. 17% of the burials involve identified individuals, while another 54 lie in unmarked graves, despite their identities being known at the time of interment. 7% of the grave Grave markers are placed as cenotaphs, which I just said is a memorial without a corresponding burial. Just 2% of the victims were cremated. So I mentioned before, it's likely that the burning of huge piles of debris on irreclaimable land during restoration efforts likely served as funeral pyres for some. And it's probable that their remains will never be recovered. Numerous individuals were reported missing following the failure. Although a few victims have been unearthed over the years, 103 remain unaccounted for today. However, at least some of the missing are likely those that were buried without being identified. Thus, the number of casualties cannot be specified as an exact number, but instead is a range between 343 and 411. At this time, the government officially recognizes the failure through one memorial. It's a California Historical Landmark plaque that sits in front of LADWP Power Plant 2, not at the dam site. In 2003, in honor of the 75th anniversary of the failure, the DWP placed a 20-foot tall monument which provided a timeline and pertinent statistics pertaining to the disaster. This is the blue monument in the center there. Illustrating the ephemeral nature of commemoration, this memorial lasted only a few years before the printing became difficult to read, and it was felt disrespectful to the victims to leave it in a faded, dilapidated condition. So the LADWP had the memorial painted over less than 10 years after it was placed. And it sits there today, and people ask, what is that? Most of the memorialization observed was community created. Each memorial found illustrated unique aspects of the disaster wished to be remembered and commemorated by the community that erected it. In Santa Paula, for example, is this warning sculpture, a monument that honors motorcycle policemen who warned residents of the torrent of water coming down through the valley. As Santa Paula is 45 miles downstream from the dam, the communities received warning in time for many lives to be saved. In other areas closer to the dam site, there was no warning, and memorials have been placed in honor of the dead, such as this community memorial at Reese Cemetery in San Francisco Canyon. This memorial to flood victims was placed in May of 1928 by silent film star William S. Hart and the Newhall Cowboys. This memorial was meant to mark a little boy that sat in the Newhall morgue for many days unidentified. And nobody could understand why his family couldn't recognize him because he had been recovered immediately. William Hart, this pulled at his heartstrings, and he decided to buy an outfit to bury the boy in, and that he was going to pay to have him buried and mark the grave. And just before that was to take place, his family did identify him. Him and his mom had been staying at McIntyre's service station in Castaic. They were in one of the cabins, and so they were driving from up north, driving to LA, and they were totally taken out, and nobody locally knew who they were because they were just driving through. So it took time for family to go, wait a minute, she hasn't returned home. She was driving through this area. The family subsequently came down here and identified both mother and baby boy Traxler. They are today buried in Oakwood Cemetery in Chatsworth, and they're both in unmarked graves. I was able to find through archival resources that there were numerous memorials that were placed following the disaster, although not as many as are observable on the landscape today. These plaque monuments were commonly erected by local community organizations. Commemorative activities on the 50th and 75th anniversaries of the disaster resulted in the placing of several memorials, which still exist today. And I'm happy to report that my thesis is completely out of date after this month's activities, so I better get back to it, documenting things. The 54-mile flood zone, a large expanse of small heterogeneous communities, presents a significant challenge with respect to effectively placing one memorial that represents the remembrances of individual survivors and their communities. Several attempts at large-scale memorialization, including the St. Francis Dam Disaster Memorial Highway and the memorial project Moments in Time have been met with resistance or not embraced by multiple communities. A lot of times it's just very difficult to get funding for these sorts of things too. No formal monument currently exists at the St. Francis Dam site, though the ruins do serve as an informal memorial to the disaster. The site consists of several dynamited blocks of dam and the dynamited west wall dike, and it's bisected by a former section of San Francisco Canyon Road. At this point, access to the dam is along the former road, which is now a footpath. In 2005, the road washed out, and the new Canyon Road is a reroute around that area. The matter of the dam site sitting alone along an unmarked and abandoned section of road, unmemorialized and out of the eye of the public, has recently generated interest in having the site designated as a national monument. Memorial, okay, national memorial. The public narrative observable today is largely due to an efforts of a network of historical societies and dam historians, some of whom have come to be known as dammies. Local historical societies throughout the flood zone acknowledge the failure on anniversary dates, such as we're doing here today, hosting talks, visiting the ruins of the dam. Some of the dammies are involved with local media and generate articles and interest around the anniversary dates. Most of the dammies have communicated firsthand with survivors and descendants, influencing their understanding and remembering of disaster is what they choose to share with the public. Important component of my research has continued to be public outreach. Through CSUN's Forgotten Casualties project, we've been able to engage students and other heritage stakeholders to better understand the impact of the disaster on the lives of people in the flood path and significance for social history in Southern California. As part of this project, my graduate advisor, James Sneed, and I created St. Francis Dam Archaeology, which is a Facebook page which serves as a virtual memorial where descendants, dammies, and other stakeholders communicate, thus creating an online space for the sharing of information and remembering of the disaster to continue past these anniversary events. On behalf of the Faces of the Flood Path, we owe it to keep this memory alive. I appreciate every one of you coming out today, sharing your stories. Appreciate SCV TV being here to record this so that this is here in perpetuity for our descendants to be able to experience the 90th anniversary of the disaster. I welcome any questions that you might have. Thank you very much for your attention.
Is any of this online?
My thesis is available online through SCV History. If you just search Ann Stansell and St. Francis, it's one of the first things that comes up. It's a 2014 thesis that has a lot of the images I use today, as well as a full list of the victims' graves, grave locations, and biographical information about them.
What about the things that you scanned in, the flame form?
That's a work in progress. Leon Worden with SCV History and I were working on designing a website that can live on that site, that can link to other events that have been posted there, and it will have the claims files, it will have biographical information, and I hope it has a means by which people can self-identify as descendants or researchers interested. Because one thing that I found is a lot of us research over each other, duplicating efforts when there's so much to be done. So hopefully this will one day be a location that just won't have the claim files, but will have any information that people have compiled about the victims specifically. Thanks. Yes, please.
Is there still debris that they find left over?
Yes, there is. And recently, what I've been hearing come up specifically is that on private land where it wasn't cleared off, you have remnants of things like part of the power plant too. And so these people now are engaging people to come in and excavate, see what they can find, and see what's there potentially. That's just one example. There's also remnants all throughout the landscape that you can see. Just remnant of St. Francis. Within the canyon itself, some of the walls still retain scour marks. Don Ray took me once to an overturned highway bridge that's still right there next to the parking lot at Magic Mountain, which is quite interesting. I think that would have been the old road or 99. So there are still, but it's an interesting thing being an archaeologist and studying something that's been cleaned up after, you know, as far as disaster, where they did all these efforts to clean. But I've wondered, like, beyond burning debris piles, where did they transport all this to? Is there some amazing stash of everything that's removed from the flood zone we could go through? But I have not heard anything.
Did you come to any conclusion about why some people's graves were unmarked?
No, I really had hoped to make some sort of correlation having to do with it was monetary or whatnot. What I found most commonly is that if the entire family was wiped out, nobody was left behind to represent them. And so sometimes the Red Cross stepped in or the Mexican Blue Cross. But it seems there's a correlation with entire families being wiped out and lack of memorialization.
About 12, 15 years ago, more or less, we did a National Register of Historic Places nomination. You're probably familiar with it for the Forest Service to list the dam site on the National Register. For some reason, it never go anywhere, and we would love to see that revived.
Well, so my first archaeology internship was at the Angeles National Forest, and I came across your National Register nomination that had been returned from the State Historic Preservation Officer. And they said there was just 2 or 3 minor things that the newer forms needed, like a few photos with GPS points. I did offer as part of my internship to go out and complete that. And the Angeles Forest assured me that they're working on it and we'll get there. I did the internship in 2012, 13, so I haven't seen it submitted, but it's there, very close, and that would be a huge thing. It's very important that the site be placed on the National Register. This really is a foundational step that's needed for things like a memorial or monument.
We have a little debate going on with the Office of Historic Preservation over whether or not it's eligible, which we don't crazy because, well, it's not there anymore.
It's very true.
Typically, it's a site. Well, if it was there, it would be historically significant. So,
Absolutely.
a little bit of a catch me if you call it that. So I don't know if that's going to break up. It should get finished sometime.
It should be close. I have seen questions asked after recently, so hopefully that will prompt some of their arguments. Please, in the back.
Just a point of interest. This reminds me of, since we're here at Camulos, one of our former docents often told stories of his experience or the experiences of his family during the disaster. And there's a page in the St. Francis Dam book that's about his family, but his name was Bizbasolo, and 2 of his uncles were washed away. They were trying to get out from where they were in their automobiles, and the 2 uncles were in the last car, and they got washed away, and one of them survived and one of them did not. But
The other one's Georgie, who's buried at Bardsdale.
okay, very, very good.
And the interview, the SCDP also has an interview of Biz that you can go online and listen to.
Right.
The story that we've heard many times.
Right.
This is passing.
Please.
I wonder, when were the remains of the dam dynamited and sort of tried to look like they're part of the scenery?
I think
And was
there's
that
been
controversial?
Certainly, yes. There's been several phases of dynamiting, and we actually recently came across video footage of the dynamiting take place. It is on the SCD History website. It's quite amazing. It's specifically the west wall they're dynamiting, not the main section. But essentially what took place is it was a eyesore, a source of vulnerability in the community, many different things. But ultimately what occurred is in June, a boy and a friend were up at the dam site. They were playing. One of the boys fell off one of the remnants, the tombstone section, and the city of Los Angeles ended up having to pay out a claim for the loss of his life. And it's very clear that was the last claim payout they were going to make. So they did have the ruins dynamited. So that took place in the summer of 1929. There's accounts of it in the LA Times describing actually how they set it up and how the tombstone fell, and now we have that video footage. as well. And people have also told me they've gone up there later and there were larger sections. So I know there was another round of dynamiting at a later date, but I don't know when that was. And I think part of that was largely more downstream where there's large remnants that were carried down. They dynamited so they looked more like natural top like features. Excellent. If you are a descendant or have family that was involved in the disaster that was killed, I'd be happy to send you the City of Los Angeles claim file. See me afterwards and I'll get your email address and make sure that's sent to you. Same thing with personal property claim files. You can do that and you can see what your ancestors or relatives had in their house in 1928. It's quite fascinating. Thank you very much.